Reincarnation and the Law of Karma by William Walker Atkinson, 1908. This is Chapter 11, Arguments Against Reincarnation. Chapter 10 was The Proofs of Reincarnation. This again is Chapter 11, Arguments Against Reincarnation. Honest consideration of any subject necessitates the examination of the other side of the case, as well as the affirmative side. We have given much space here to the presentation and consideration of the arguments advanced by those convinced of the truth of reincarnation. And before closing our work, we think it well to give at least a little glimpse of the other side, as it is presented by the opponents of the doctrine, together with the reply to the same usually made by the reincarnationists. The first adverse argument usually presented is that the advocates of reincarnation have not established the existence of a soul which may reincarnate, nor have they proven its nature if it does exist. The natural reply to this is that the doctrine of reincarnation is not called upon to establish the proof of the existence of the soul, as the idea of existence of the soul practically is universal, and therefore axiomatic, that is, it is a truth that may be considered as an axiom or a self-evident truth, worthy of being assumed as a principle, necessary to thought on the subject, a proposition which it is necessary to take for granted, an established principle of thought on the subject. Strictly speaking, perhaps the fact of the existence of the soul is incapable of material proof, except to those who accept the fact of proven spirit return, either in the shape of unmistakable manifestation of the disincarnate soul by materialization, or by equally unmistakable manifestation in the shape of communications of some sort from such discarnate soul. Science does not admit that there are any real proofs of the existence of a soul which persists after the death of the body, but all religious, and at least the older philosophical thought, generally agrees that the existence of such a soul is a self-evident fact, needing no proofs. Many regard the statement of Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," as a logical proof of the existence of an immaterial soul. And others hold that the self-consciousness of every human being is sufficient proof that the ego, or I, is a something immaterial, ruling the material body which it inhabits. And so the reincarnationists claim that this demand upon them for proof of the existence of the soul is not a fair one, because such discussion belongs to a more general field of thought, that they are justified in starting with the idea that the soul does exist as an axiomatic truth, and that their real task is to establish not that the soul exists, but that it reincarnates after the death of the body. As Figway says, the difficulty is not to prove that there is a spiritual principle in us that resists death. For to question the existence of this principle, we must doubt thought. The true problem is to ascertain if the spiritual or immortal principle within us is going to live again after death in ourselves or somebody else. The question is, will the immortal soul be born again in the same individual, physically transformed into the same person? As to the other objection, that the reincarnationists have not proven the nature of the soul, to which many of the advocates of the doctrine feel it necessary to reply at great length and with much subtle reasoning, we feel that the objection is not well taken. So far as reincarnation is concerned, if it be taken as an axiom that the soul really exists, that is sufficient as a beginning for the argument in favor of the doctrine. And the proof or disproof of any special theory regarding the nature of the soul is outside of the main question. So we shall not consider it here. It is possible to think of the soul as a reincarnating entity, whether it be a monad, duad, triad, or septenary being. The second objection usually made is that reincarnation cannot be true. Else we would remember the incidents of our past lives clearly and distinctly. The fact that the majority of persons have no such recollection being held to be a disproof of the doctrine. The reply to this objection is, 1. that it is not true that people do not remember the events of their past lives. The instances quoted by us and similar ones happening to others, together with the fact that nearly everyone remembers something of the past, showing that the objection is not correctly stated. And two, that the fact that we have but a very cloudy and imperfect recollection is not an objection at all. For we have a clear recollection of the events of our infancy and childhoodness. Not an objection at all. For have we a clear recollection of the events of our infancy and childhood in this life? Have we a clear recollection of the events of 20 years ago? Outside of a few scattered instances, of which the majority are only recalled when some associated fact is mentioned. Are not the great majority of the events of our present life completely forgotten? How many can recall the events of the youthful life? Old companions and friends are completely forgotten, or only recalled after much thought and assistance in the way of suggested association. Then again, do we not witness a complete forgetfulness in cases of very old people who relapse into a state of second childhood, and who then live entirely in the present, the past having vanished for them? There are cases of people who have, having grown old, and while retaining their reasoning faculties, were as children, so far as the past was concerned. A well-known writer, when in this state, was wont to read the books that he had written, enjoying them very much and not dreaming that he was their author. Professor Knight says of this matter, memory of the details of the past is absolutely impossible. The power of the conservative faculty, though relatively great, is extremely limited. We forget the larger portion of experience soon after we have passed through it, and we should be able to recall the particulars of our past years, filling all the missing links of consciousness since we entered on the present life, before we were in a position to remember our antenatal experience. Birth must necessarily be preceded by crossing the river of oblivion, while the capacity for fresh acquisition survives, and the garnered wealth of old experience determines the amount and characters of the new. Loss of memory is not loss of being, or even loss of individuality or character. In this connection, we must mention the various instances of double personality or lost personality noted in the recent books on psychology. There are a number of well-authenticated cases in which people, from severe mental strain, overwork, etc., have lost the thread of personality and forgotten even their own names, and who have taken up life anew under new circumstances, which they would continue until something would occur to bring about a restoration of memory, when the past in all of its details would come back in a flash. The Annals of English Society for Psychical Research. The Annals of the English Society for Psychical Research, contain quite a number of such cases, which are recognized as typical. Now, would one be justified in asserting that such a person, while living in the secondary personality, and consequently in entire ignorance of his past life, had really experienced no previous life? The same I was there, the same ego, and yet the personality was entirely different. It is not perfectly fair and reasonable to consider these cases as similar. Is it not perfectly fair and reasonable to consider these cases as similar to the absence of memory in cases of reincarnation? Let the reader lay down this book and then endeavor to remember what happened in his 12th year of life. You would not remember more than one or two or half a dozen events in that year, perhaps not one, in the absence of a diary, or perhaps even with the aid of one. The majority of the happenings of the 365 days of that year are as a blank, as if they had never happened, so far as the memory is concerned. And yet, the same I, or ego, persists, and the person's character has certainly been affected and influenced by the experiences and lessons of that year. Perhaps in that year, the person may have acquired a certain knowledge that he uses in his everyday life. And so, in this case, as with reincarnation, the essence of the experiences are preserved, while the details are forgotten. For that is the reincarnationist contention. As a matter of fact, advanced occultists and other reincarnationists claim that nothing is really forgotten, but that every event is stored away in some of the recesses of the mind, below the level of consciousness, which idea agrees with that of modern psychologists. And reincarnationists claim that when man unfolds sufficiently on some higher plane, he will have a full recollection of his past experiences in all of his incarnations. Some reincarnationists claim that as the soul passes from the body, all the events of that particular life pass rapidly before its mind, in review, before the waters of Lethe, or oblivion, causes forgetfulness. Closely allied to the last mentioned argument against reincarnation is the one that, as the memory of the past life is absent, or nearly so, the new personality is practically a new soul, instead of the old one reincarnated, and that it is unreasonable and unjust to have it enjoy or suffer by reasons of its experiences and acts in the previous life. We think that the answers to the last mentioned objection are answers to this one also. The I, ego or individuality, being the same, it matters not if the details of the old personality be forgotten. You are the same I that lived 50 years ago in the same body, or even 10 years ago, and you are enjoying certain things or suffering from certain things, done or left undone at the previous time, although you had forgotten the incidents. The impress of the thing is on your character, and you are today largely what you are by reason of what you have been in past years, though those years are forgotten by you. This you will readily admit. And yet the argument of the reincarnationists is merely an extension of the same idea. As Figueres says, the soul, in spite of its journeys, in the midst of its incarnations and divers metamorphoses, remains always identical with itself. Only at each metempsychosis, each metamorphosis of the external being, improving and purifying itself, growing in power and intellectual grasp. Another argument against reincarnation is that it is not necessary, for the reason that heredity accounts for all of the facts claimed as corroborative of reincarnation. Answering this, the advocates of the doctrine insist that heredity does not account for all the facts, inasmuch as children are born with marked talents and genius, while none of their family for generations back have displayed any such tendencies. They also claim that if heredity were the only factor in the case, there would be no advance in the races, as the children would be precisely like their ancestors, no variety or improvement being possible. But it must be remembered that reincarnationists do not deny certain effects of heredity, particularly along physical lines, and to an extent along mental lines, in the way of perpetuating tendencies, which, however, are and may be overcome by the individuality of the child. Moreover, the doctrine holds that one of the laws of rebirth is that the reincarnating soul is attracted to parents harmonious to itself, and likely to afford the environments and association desirable to the soul. So in this way, the characteristics likely to be transmitted to the offspring are those which are sought for and desired by the reincarnating soul. The law of rebirth is held to be as exact and certain as the laws of mathematics or chemistry. The parents, as well as the child, forming the combination which brings forth the rebirth. Rebirth is held to be above and the mere wish of the reincarnating soul. It is in accordance with an invariable natural law, which has justice and advancement as its basis. Another argument against reincarnation is that it holds that human souls are reborn as animals in some cases, This objection we shall not discuss, for the reason that the advanced ideas of reincarnation expressly forbid any such interpretation and distinctly deny its legitimate place in the doctrine. Among some of the primitive people, this idea of transmigration in the bodies of animals has been held, but never among advanced occultists or the leaders in philosophical thought favoring reincarnation. Reincarnation teaches the evolution of the soul from lowly forms to higher, but never the devolution or going back into animal forms. A study of the doctrine of reincarnation will dispel this erroneous idea from the mind of an intelligent person. Another favorite argument is that it is repulsive to the mind and soul of the average person. Analysis of this objection will show that what is repugnant to the person is usually the fear that he will be born again without a memory of the present, which seems like a loss of the self. A moment's consideration will show that this objection is ill-founded. No one objects to the idea of living in the same body for, say, 10 years or 20 years more in health. But at the end of that 10 or 20 years, he will be practically a different person by reason of the new experiences he has undergone. Persons change very much in 20 years, and yet they are the same individuals. The same I is there with them. And at the end of 20 years, they will have forgotten the majority of the events of the present year. But they do not object to that. When one realizes that the individual, or I, is the real self instead of the personality, or the John Smith, grocer, age 36, part of them, then will they cease to fear the loss of the personality of the day or year. They will know that the I is the self, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Be the doctrine of reincarnation true or false, the fact remains that so long as you exist, it will be the same I in you, and that you will know that I am. It will always be I am here now with you. Be it this moment or 100 years or 1,000,000 years hence. You can never be someone else. No matter what form you wear, nor by what name you are known, nor what personality you may be acting through, nor in what place you may have your abode, nor on what plane of existence you may be. You will always be yourself. And as we have just said, it will always be, I am here now with you. The body, and even the personality, are things akin to garments which you wear and to take off without affecting your real self. Well, then we must note another objection often made by people in discussing reincarnation. They say, but I do not want to come back. And to this, the reincarnationists answer that if one has reached a stage in which he really has no desire for anything that earth can offer him, then such a soul will not likely have to reincarnate again on earth, for it has passed beyond the need of earthly experiences and has worn out its earth karma. But they hold that but few people really have reached this stage. What one really means is that he does not want any more of earth life similar to that which he has been undergoing. But if he thought that he could have certain things, riches, position, fame, beauty, influence, the rest of it, he would be perfectly willing to come back. Or else he might be so bound by links of karma, acting by reason of love or hate, attachment or repulsion, or by duties unperformed, or moral debts unpaid, that he might be brought back to work out the old problems until he had solved them. But even this is explained by those reincarnationists who hold to the idea of desire as the great motive power of karma, and who hold that if one has arisen above all earthly desire or dislike, well, that soul is freed from the attraction of earth life and is prepared to go on higher at once. Or else wait in realms of bliss until the race is ready to pass on. The race, according to the various theories held by the various advocates of the doctrine. A little self-examination will show one whether he is free from all desire to come back or not. But after all, if there is ultimate justice in the plan, working ever and ever for our good and advancements, as the reincarnationists claim, then it must follow that each of us is in just the best place for his own good at the present moment. And will always be in a like advantageous position and condition. And if that be so, then there is no cause for complaint or objection on our part, and our sole concern should be, in the words of the Persian sage, to so live, that that which must come and will come may come well. Living on one day at a time, doing the best you know how, living always in the belief that it is well with us now and evermore, and that the power which has us in charge here will have us in charge there. This is a good philosophy for living and dying. And this being true, though you may have to come back, you will not have to go back or fall behind in the scale of advancement or spiritual evolution, where it must always be onward and upward on the ladder of life, such is the law. Another objection, very often urged against the doctrine of reincarnation, is that it is unchristian and derived from pagan and heathen sources, and is not in accord with the highest conceptions of the immortality of the soul. Answering this objection, it may be said that, insofar as reincarnation is not a generally accepted doctrine in the Orthodox Christian churches of today, it may be said to be non-Christian rather than unchristian. But when it is seen that pre-existence and rebirth was held as truth by many of the early fathers of the church, and that this doctrine was finally condemned by the dominant majority in church councils only by means of the most severe methods and the exercise of the most arbitrary authority, it may be seen that in the opinion of many of the most eminent early authorities there was nothing unchristian about it. But it was a proper doctrine of the church. The doctrine was simply voted down, just as were many important doctrines revered by some of the great minds of the early church, in some cases the decision being made by a majority of one vote. And again, there have been many bright minds in the Christian church who persisted in the belief that the doctrine was far more consistent with the inner teachings of Christianity than the prevailing conception, and based upon quite as good authority. So far as the charge that it is derived from pagan and heathen sources is concerned, it must be answered that certainly the doctrine was accepted by the pagan and heathen world centuries before the dawn of Christianity. But for that matter, so was the doctrine regarding the soul's future generally accepted by the Orthodox Christianity. In fact, nearly every doctrine or theory regarding the survival of the soul was derived from pagan and heathen sources, so to speak. The pagan and heathen mind had thought long and earnestly upon this great problem, and the field of thought had been pretty well covered before the advent of Christianity. In fact, Christianity added no new doctrine, invented no new theory, and is far from being clear and explicit in its teachings on the subject. The result being that the early Christians were divided among themselves on the matter. Different sects and schools favoring different doctrines, each and all of which had been, so to speak, derived from pagan and heathen sources. If all the doctrines regarding the immortality of the soul are to be judged by the test of their having been or not been derived from pagan and heathen sources, then the entire body of doctrine and thought on the subject must be thrown out of the Christian mind. which must then endeavor to create or invent an entirely new doctrine which has never been thought of by a pagan or heathen. A very difficult task, by the way, considering the activity of the pagan and heathen mind in that respect. It must be remembered that there is no authoritative teaching on this subject, none coming direct from Jesus. The Christian doctrines on the subject came from the theologians and represent simply the views of the majority of some church council or of the most powerful faction. While the objection that reincarnation is not in accord with the highest conceptions of the immortality of the soul is one that must depend almost entirely upon the personal bias or opinion of the individual as to what constitutes the highest conceptions. Still, a comparison of the conceptions is not out of the way at this place. Do you know what was the doctrine favored by the dominant majority in the church councils? And for which pre-existence and rebirth finally was discarded? Do you know the dogma of the church and the belief of masses of the Orthodox Christians of the early centuries? Well, it was this: that at the death of the body, the person passes into a state of coma or unconsciousness, in which state he rests today, awaiting the sound of the trumpet of the great day of judgment, when the dead shall be raised and the righteous given eternal life in their former bodies, while the wicked in their bodies may pass into eternal torment. That's the doctrine. You doubt it? Then look over the authorities and examine even the current creeds of today, many of which state practically the same thing. This belief passed into one of the Christian creed. This belief passed into one of the Christian creed in the words, "I believe in the resurrection of the body." The great masses of Christians today, in general thought on the subject, speak as if the accepted doctrine of the church was that the soul passed into judgment and then eternal soul life in heaven or hell immediately after the death of the body, thus ignoring the dogmas of the church councils regarding the future day of judgment and the resurrection of the body at that time. A little questioning of the religious teachers and a little examination of religious history and the creeds and doctrines of their respective churches would astonish many good church members who have been fondly thinking of their beloved ones who have passed on, as even now dwelling in heaven as blessed angels. They would be astonished to find that the angels of the churches are not the souls of the good people who have been judged and awarded heavenly joys, but rather a body of supernatural beings who never inhabited the flesh. And that instead of their loved ones now enjoying the heavenly realms, the dogmas hold that they are now in a state of a coma or unconsciousness, awaiting the great day of judgment, when their bodies will be resurrected and life everlasting given them. Those who are interested in the matter and who may doubt the above statement are invited to examine the records for themselves. The doctrine of the resurrection of the body, which is of undoubted pagan and heathen origin, was a favorite theological dogma of the church in the first 1,000 years of its existence, and for many centuries after, and it still occupies a most important place in the church doctrines today, although it is not so often publicly preached or taught. David Kay says, the great distinguishing doctrine of Christianity is not the immortality of the soul, but the resurrection of the body. That the soul of man is immortal was a common belief among the ancients, from whom it found its way into an early period of the Christian church. But the most influential of the early fathers were strenuously opposed to it, holding that the human soul was not essentially immortal, but only, like the body, capable of immortality. Vinay says, the union of the soul and body appears to me essential and indissoluble. Man without a body is, in my opinion, man no longer. and God has thought and willed him embodied, and not otherwise. According to passages in the scriptures, we cannot doubt that the body, or a body, is essential to human personality and to the very idea of man. John Milton said that the spirit of man should be separate from the body, so as to have a perfect and intelligent existence independent of it, is nowhere said in the scripture. And the doctrine is evidently at variance both with nature and reason. Masson, commenting on Milton's conception, says, Milton's conception is that at the last gasp of breath, the whole man dies, soul and body together, and that not until the resurrection, when the body is revived, does the soul live again. And does the man or woman live again, in any sense or way, whether for happiness or misery? Are the souls of the millions on millions of human beings who have died since Adam, are those souls ready either with God and the angels in heaven, or down in the diabolic world waiting to be rejoined to their bodies on the resurrection day? They are not, says Milton, but soul and bodies together, he says, are dead alike, sleeping alike, defunct alike, until that day comes. And many Christian theologians have held firmly to this doctrine, as may be seen by reference to any standard encyclopedia or work on theology. Coleridge said, some of the most influential of the early Christian writers were materialists, not as holding the soul to be the mere result of bodily organization, but as holding the soul itself to be material, corporeal. It appears that in those days the vulgar held the soul to be incorporeal, according to the views of Plato and others, but that the Orthodox Christian divines looked upon this as an impious, unscriptural opinion. Dr. R.S. Candlish says, you live again in the body, in the very body, as to all essential properties, and to all practical intents and purposes in which you live now. I am to live not a ghost, a specter, a spirit. I am to live then, as I live now, in the body. Dr. Arnold says, I think that the Christian doctrine of the resurrection meets the materialist so far as this, that it does not imply that a body or an organization of some sort is necessary to the full development of man's nature. Reverend R.J. Campbell, the eminent English clergyman, in his recent work entitled The New Theology, says, speaking of the popular evangelical views, but they are even more chaotic on the subject of death and whatever follows death. It does not seem to be generally recognized that Christian thought has never been really clear concerning the resurrection, especially in relation to future judgment. One view has been that the deceased saint lies sleeping in the grave until the archangel's trumpet shall sound and bid all mankind awake for the great assize. Anyone who reads the New Testament without prejudice will see that this was Paul's earlier view, although later on he changed it for another. There is a good deal of our current everyday religious phraseology which presumes it's still, Father, in thy gracious keeping, leave we now thy servant sleeping. But alongside this view, another which is a flagrant contradiction of it has come down to us, namely, that immediately after death the soul goes straight to heaven or hell, as the case may be, without waiting for the archangel's trumpet and the grand assize. On the whole, this is the dominant theory of the situation in the Protestant circles, and is much less reasonable than the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, however much the latter may have been abused. But under this view, what is the exact significance of the judgment day and the physical resurrection? One might think they might be accounted superfluous. What is the good of tormenting a soul in hell for ages, and then whirling it back to the body in order to rise again and receive a solemn public condemnation. Better leave it in the inferno and save trouble, especially as the solemn trial is meaningless, seeing that a part of the sentence has already been undergone and there is no hope that any portion of it will ever be remitted. Truly, the tender mercies with which the theologians have credited the Almighty are cruel indeed. But, by the irony of progress, the Orthodox churches are gradually coming around to the one much despised Platonic conception of the naturally immortal, immaterial soul. The pagan and heathen idea, so much at variance with the opposing doctrine of the resurrection of the body, which doctrine really did not teach the immortality of the soul at all. As Professor Nathaniel Schmidt says in an article in a standard encyclopedia, the doctrine of the natural immortality of the human soul became so important a part of Christian thought that the resurrection naturally lost its vital significance. And it has practically held no place in the great systems of philosophy elaborated by the Christian thinkers of modern times. But still, the letter of the old doctrine persists on the books of the church and in its creeds. Although opposed to the enlightened spirit now manifesting in the churches, which is moving more and more toward the pagan and heathen conception of a naturally immaterial and immortal soul, rather than in a resurrection of the body and an eternal life therein. It is scarcely worthwhile here to contrast the two doctrines. The immortal immaterial soul on the one hand, and the immortal body on the other. The latter conception is so primitively crude and is so far into modern thought that it scarcely needs an argument against it. The thought of the necessity of the soul for a material body, the same old material body that it once cast off like a worn-out garment, a body perhaps worn by disease, crippled by accident, or the slipping of the hand of the potter, so to speak, a body similar to those we see around us every day. The immortal soul needing such a garment in order to exist. Better accept plain materialism and say there is no soul and that the body perishes and all else with it than such a gross doctrine which is simply a materialistic immortality. So far as this doctrine being the highest conception of the immortality of the soul, as contrasted with the pagan and heathen doctrine of reincarnation, it's not a conception of the immortality of the soul at all, but a flat contradiction of it. It is a doctrine of the immortality of the body, which bears plain marks of a very lowly pagan and heathen origin. And as to the later Christian conception, it may be seen that there is nothing in the idea of rebirth which is inconsistent therewith. In fact, the two ideas naturally blend into each other. In the above discussion, our whole intent has been to answer the argument against reincarnation, which charges that the latter is derived from pagan and heathen sources and is not in accord with the highest conceptions of the immortality of the soul. And in order to do this, we have found it necessary to examine the opposing theological dogmas as we find them, and to show that they do not come up to the claims of being the highest conception, etc. We think that the strongest point against the dogmas may be found in the claims of their advocates. That the church is now growing away from them only proves their unfitness as the highest conception. And reincarnationists hold that as the church grows in favor of the immaterial or immortal soul, so will it find itself inclining toward the companion doctrine of pre-existence and rebirth, in some of its varied forms, probably that of the early fathers of the church, such as Origen and his followers, that the church will again claim its own. Chapter 12 will be the final chapter. Chapter 12 is called the law of karma. That's coming up next.